December 20th, 1941. Hypo Station, Pearl Harbor, Territory of Hawaii. The stifling heat of the makeshift code-breaking unit, crammed into the damp, leaky basement of the administration building, nicknamed the dungeon, was almost unbearable. The only respite was the hum of the cooling fans struggling to keep the IBM punch card machines from overheating, a sound drowned out only by the frenetic clatter of teletype receivers spitting out endless streams of Japanese naval radio traffic. The air hung thick with stale cigar smoke, unwashed coffee mugs, and the raw, electric tension of men working under a sentence of doom. Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man whose casual, often rumpled appearance belied a razor-sharp intellect and a profound understanding of the Japanese psyche, leaned over a scarred wooden table. His face, partially obscured by the shadow of a hanging bare bulb lamp, showed the strain of weeks operating on minimal sleep and maximum pressure. The attack on Pearl Harbor, just 13 days prior, had shattered the Pacific Fleet, but it had also irrevocably validated Rochefort's Unit Hypo, the small, intensely focused team of linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators known as the Combat Intelligence Unit. They were the front line in a hidden war, fighting not with torpedoes and dive bombers, but with ciphers and hunches. "It's the same block, Commander," Ensign Wesley Ham, Wright reported, his voice tight with fatigue, pointing a grease pencil at a dense block of alphanumeric code on a large chart. "The JN-25B. We've got the date-time groups, we've got the preambles, but the operative group additives, they're rotating faster than we can strip them out." Rochefort didn't need a summary. He knew the cipher. JN-25B was the Japanese Imperial Navy's primary operational code, a fiendishly complex system using a super-encipherment layer of random number additives on top of a book code. It was their strategic backbone. Before December 7th, the Japanese had maintained a level of radio silence that masked their massive operational planning. Now, with the fleet dispersed and operating aggressively across the Pacific, their traffic volume had exploded. It was a deluge of data, but it was like drinking from a fire hose. They were drowning in information, yet starving for meaning. "They're preparing for the next move, gentlemen," Rochefort stated, tapping his pipe against the desk blotter, sending a shower of spent tobacco ash onto the floor. "This isn't just about consolidating gains in the Philippines and Malaysia. They're planning something big, something final." The room's inhabitants, a mix of young, anxious reservists and seasoned Navy veterans, knew the gravity of that statement. Japan was winning everywhere. If they could cripple the remaining American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, the war in the Pacific would effectively be over before it truly began. For weeks, the men of Hypo worked in shifts, their lives reduced to the sterile confines of the dungeon, their world the cryptic symbols on their message pads. The code-breaking process was a grinding, agonizing war of attrition. They attacked the code from every conceivable angle: frequency analysis, traffic analysis, crib generation, and even statistical linguistics. They weren't reading the entire code. That was impossible. But they were slowly, painfully, piecing together enough partial information to build a terrifying picture. They identified key phrases, command structures, and most importantly, recurring destination designators. In the late winter months of 1942, a pattern began to emerge. A constant, heavy stream of traffic originated from Admiral Yamamoto Isoroka's headquarters, signaling preparations for a massive, multi-carrier task force operation. And in the message streams, one two-letter designator started flashing red: AF. AF is the linchpin, Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, the Fleet Intelligence Officer, would later observe in a meeting with Rochefort. It's the code for the main objective. Every time it appears, it's connected to their carriers, their invasion forces, and unprecedented logistical planning. But what was AF? It was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. Without knowing the target, the entire intelligence picture was useless. The Japanese had dozens of potential targets remaining. The west coast of the United States, perhaps? Hawaii again? Or a remote island outpost, the last stepping stone to a total Pacific domination? Rochefort felt the weight of the Pacific Fleet resting squarely on his shoulders. He needed to find out what AF meant, and he needed to do it immediately. The pressure building in the basement of Hypo Station was now palpable, the strategic clock ticking down to zero. By late April 1942, the decrypted messages clearly pointed to a massive naval action centered around the AF objective, slated for the first week of June. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was demanding a definitive identification. The problem, Rochefort explained repeatedly to the skeptical intelligence staff in Nimitz's command, was that the Japanese operational code designers were deliberately using generic, non-place name designators. AF could fit several American-held islands in the mid-Pacific. The most compelling candidate, based on geographical analysis and Japanese strategic positioning, was Midway Atoll, a tiny, critical speck of land less than 1,500 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, guarding the approach to Hawaii itself. Yet other intelligence groups, particularly the Washington, D.C. code-breaking unit known as OP-20G or NEGAT, were convinced the target was much further south, perhaps Johnston Island or even Palmyra. The rift between Hypo and NEGAT was immediate and severe. NEGAT, far removed from the Pacific operational theater, favored pure cryptanalysis and theoretical deduction, leaning towards a complex, larger operation against a more logistically prepared base. Rochefort, utilizing his intimate knowledge of Japanese radio operators' habits, their quirks and phrasing, and the sheer volume of radio chatter, focused on a central point, argued forcefully for Midway. "They are practicing their landings, Ed," Rochefort insisted to Leighton, gesturing at a sheaf of translated messages detailing amphibious training. The volume of traffic associated with AF suggests a major installation that must be eliminated to protect the home islands, not just an isolated refueling stop. Midway is the historical and geographic key. The crux of the debate lay in the two letters, A and F. In Japanese transliterated codes, AF roughly corresponded to the sound AFU or AFU. The Japanese Naval Geography Codebook, which Hypo had partial access to, contained no direct match. Rochefort's hypothesis rested on tactical probability and traffic analysis. The density of Japanese communications was almost entirely focused on Midway's longitude. Nimitz, caught between two conflicting intelligence reports, one from his forward-deployed unit, Hypo, and one from Washington NEGAT, could not afford to be wrong. If he committed his precious remaining carriers to the wrong location, Japan would win the war in one fell swoop. The situation was desperate, the clock was ticking, and Rochefort needed empirical, irrefutable proof. The proof couldn't come from another codebook. It had to come from the enemy themselves. This is where Captain Wilfred Bill Holmes, a bright, resourceful submarine officer temporarily attached to Hypo, stepped in. Holmes was not a codebreaker, but a master of deception and practical operational thinking. He grasped the political and strategic dilemma instantly. "Commander," Holmes said, puffing thoughtfully on his cigarette, "if AF is Midway, then the people on Midway know what their code is. And they need water, don't they?" The simplicity of the idea was staggering. It was a classic intelligence ruse, a deliberately planted fact designed to elicit an exploitable enemy response. The execution required extreme discretion and perfect timing. The plan, to have the garrison on Midway Atoll send a brief, urgent message over an uncoded, low-security radio frequency, the kind of traffic Japanese monitoring stations would intercept, but would likely dismiss as mundane logistical chatter, unless it contained a specific trigger word. The proposed message was concise, almost ridiculously simple. It would report a critical breakdown in the island's water purification plant, creating an artificial, immediate water shortage. Rochefort approved the plan instantly, recognizing its elegance and low cost. The only currency it risked was secrecy, which, at this stage, was a necessary gamble. May 20th, 1942. Midway Atoll and Hypo Station, Pearl Harbor. The orders crackled over the radio into the small, dusty command post on Eastern Island, Midway. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the Marine garrison, read the instructions from CNCPAC with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect for the sheer audacity of the maneuver. He was to broadcast an urgent, but casually formatted, message concerning a water emergency. The message, meticulously crafted by Captain Holmes, was designed to sound like a genuine, panicked logistics report, a distraction for any Japanese listening post. Water shortage due to breakdown of distilling plant. Request immediate repair and tanker. Critically, Shannon was instructed to send the message in the clear. No encryption. The raw, uncoded English text was hurled out across the Pacific on a frequency known to be routinely monitored by Japanese intelligence gatherers stationed on Wake Island and elsewhere. The entire ruse was predicated on the enemy's meticulous habit of intercepting all traffic, regardless of its apparent security level, and the Japanese Navy's immediate, almost clinical need to document the logistical status of any potential target. At Hypo Station, the dungeon was eerily quiet. Commander Rochefort, wearing his signature slippers and a faded smoking jacket, chain-smoked while pacing the narrow aisles between the decryption machines. The entire team, exhausted from months of intense decryption work, was now forced into a new kind of tension, the agonizing wait for a reaction. The Japanese intelligence system was known for its bureaucratic efficiency. The intercepted message regarding Midway's artificial water crisis would first pass through the low-level monitoring stations, then be filed and translated. Only then would it be routed up the intelligence chain to the planning staff responsible for the AF operation. This process could take many crucial hours. Every tick of the wall clock amplified the risk that the Japanese would realize this was a trap, or worse, the risk that they would not care about a water shortage on a tiny atoll. Ensign Wright and his team meticulously monitored the JN-25B traffic volume, looking for any deviation, any spike in activity that might signify a reaction. The minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The smoky atmosphere of the dungeon felt heavier than usual, oppressive with the weight of strategic consequence. "Nothing yet, Commander," Wright reported, his voice low. "Traffic remains heavy, mostly logistical movements regarding the northern force. No direct response to the clear text frequency." Rochefort simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the map of the Pacific Fleet disposition tacked to the wall, particularly the tiny, vulnerable dot labeled Midway. He knew they had cast their bait directly into the operational planning of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, they could only wait for the hook to set. The entire strategic pivot of the Pacific War, the fate of the remaining American fleet, rested on whether a Japanese radio operator, somewhere thousands of miles away, believed that Midway Atoll was genuinely thirsty. The waiting lasted just under 24 hours. Around noon the following day, a sudden, sharp flurry of activity erupted on the JN-25B channel used by the 4th Fleet's communication section. The new message was short, but it was being sent repeatedly and with an urgent priority designation. The team scrambled. Every resource was instantly focused on this new traffic. The pressure of time forced them to skip some of the standard cryptographic checks, focusing instead on frequency, routing, and most importantly, the known additive sequences they had painstakingly cataloged. The decryption, painstakingly slow even with the full focus of the unit, began to coalesce into recognizable Japanese characters. The message originated from an intelligence assessment unit and was being routed to the highest command level. As the Codebreakers finished transcribing the final groups, Lieutenant Commander Layton himself leaned over the shoulder of the lead translator, his breath held tight. The moment the translated Japanese characters appeared on the message pad, the oppressive silence in the dungeon evaporated, replaced by a sudden, collective gasp of realization. The message was succinct, yet devastatingly clear. It confirmed the target, the objective, and validated every risky assumption Rochefort's team had made. The translated message read, "AF is short on water. Commander requests immediate shipment of distilling equipment and ration increase." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the simple ruse had paid off. The Japanese intelligence officer, reading the uncoded emergency distress signal from Midway, the island designated internally as AF, had instantly logged the critical logistical vulnerability. In doing so, he had confirmed, in the enemy's own high-security JN-25B cipher, the precise identity of the primary objective. The designator, AF, was unequivocally Midway Atoll. The cost of this world-changing intelligence was precisely $0 and one very nervous, fake radio transmission. Commander Rochefort snatched the message slip, his usually stoic expression breaking into a rare, wide grin. He looked at Captain Holmes, whose clever deception had just won the United States Navy an incalculable advantage. "Congratulations, Bill," Rochefort said, his voice husky with relief and exhaustion. "You just saved the Pacific Fleet." The confirmation was immediately relayed to Admiral Nimitz. The Washington skepticism over Midway, the notion of a larger, more complex target, was instantly overruled by irrefutable enemy-sourced evidence. The decryption of the subsequent message traffic following the water-short confirmation further cemented the strategic picture, providing details on the strength of the approaching Japanese mobile force, including the identity and number of carriers. This intelligence, the confirmed identity of AF as Midway, was the key to the entire engagement. Without it, Nimitz would have been forced to deploy his limited carrier assets across a vast, empty ocean, searching for an enemy that outnumbered him. Now he knew exactly where and when the enemy would strike. He could break the fundamental rules of naval warfare by concentrating a numerically inferior force at the point of attack, turning the tables from a defensive search and destroy mission into a carefully laid ambush. The implications rippled instantly through the entire Pacific command structure. Nimitz ordered his carrier forces, Task Force 16, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, and the battered Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, to take up a position northeast of Midway, out of Japanese scouting range, but perfectly positioned to fall upon the enemy's approach. The war had transitioned. The Japanese, confident in the secrecy of their plans and operating under the conceit that the Americans were strategically blind, were steaming toward a predictable, fixed target. They believed the element of surprise was theirs. In reality, the deception hatched in the sweaty basement of Hypo Station had ensured the Americans possessed the ultimate, decisive advantage: perfect operational intelligence. The Codebreakers, having executed the brilliant deception, now returned to the grinding work of decoding the remaining operational messages, speed, trajectory, and rendezvous points. Their objective shifted from identification to tactical refinement. The success of the water-short trick cemented the trust Nimitz placed in Rochefort and his team, overriding the continuous political pressure from Washington to discredit the forward-deployed unit. The stage was set not for a chaotic clash, but for a devastating, calculated strike. May 28, 1942. CINCPAC Headquarters, Pearl Harbor. With the crucial confirmation of AF secured, the pace of planning shifted into high gear. The atmosphere in Admiral Nimitz's war room was electric, a stark contrast to the despair felt 6 months earlier after Pearl Harbor. The intelligence derived from Rochefort's unit Hypo, all of it stemming from the validated target identification, allowed Nimitz to issue the final operational command. The U.S. Navy would meet the overwhelming Japanese strike force at Midway. The decisive action was set for early June. The Japanese plan, meticulously revealed through the continuous decryption of JN-25B, was to divide their forces, striking Midway first with carrier air power before the main invasion force arrived. They anticipated a staggered American response from Hawaii, allowing them to defeat the U.S. carriers in detail. What they did not know was that Nimitz had already gathered every available carrier, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-up Yorktown, and positioned them to the northeast, beyond the arc of the Japanese scouting planes, exactly where Yamamoto least expected them. Commander Rochefort, now working directly with Leighton in the command bunker, was providing hour-by-hour updates on Japanese fleet movements, radio silences, and changes in their additive keys. The sheer volume of decrypted traffic allowed the Americans to predict, with startling accuracy, the timing of the enemy's critical airstrikes and the state of their readiness. Rochefort's greatest deduction, later fully validated by the battle, was the assessment of the date of the primary attack, June 4th. On that fateful morning, the advantage lay not with the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, but with a small, sweaty group of codebreakers thousands of miles away. Because the Japanese believed their target was still secret, their carriers were caught in the most vulnerable possible operational state, rearming and refueling planes from the initial strike on Midway and preparing for the next wave, their decks crowded with ordnance and fuel hoses. The resulting Battle of Midway was a turning point of staggering consequence. American dive bombers, arriving with perfect surprise and timing dictated by Hypo's intelligence, decimated 3 of the 4 carriers within minutes. The 4th, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. The tactical genius of the American pilots and the desperate courage of the Yorktown's crews were undeniable. But the strategic victory belonged squarely to the men in the basement. The consequences of the $0 water shortage trick were absolute. Japan lost 4 heavy aircraft carriers, over 200 irreplaceable pilots, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific forever. The confirmation of AF as Midway allowed the numerically inferior U.S. forces to achieve the necessary surprise, shifting the balance of naval power in one stroke. This simple, elegant piece of deception, conceived by Captain Holmes and championed by Commander Rochefort, was arguably the single most critical intelligence coup of the entire Pacific War. Despite the monumental success, the political rivalry between Hypo and Negat continued. Rochefort was soon sidelined and transferred, never receiving the major credit or promotion he deserved until years later. Yet his legacy, and the proof by deception executed by Holmes, remains the bedrock of modern military intelligence history. The moment a clever lie, broadcast in the clear, revealed the enemy's biggest secret and confirmed the date and location for the decisive naval ambush that reversed the tide of World War II. The secret war had won the shooting war.